The night air in the Arizona frontier carried the smell of rain and wood smoke. The small town of Dry Creek lay silent under the pale glow of a half-moon, its few shacks and stores half buried in red dust. At the edge of town, beside a broken fence and an old mule cart, a young woman stood alone, clutching her worn shawl around her shoulders. Her face was thin, her eyes hollow with the kind of sadness only a hard life could carve. No one looked at her anymore, and when they did, it was only to whisper. Folks in Dry Creek had long decided what she was: poor, disgraced, not worth the trouble of kindness. Her name was Clara, though most people had forgotten that. She'd come west with her father years ago, chasing a dream of land and freedom. But dreams dried up quickly under the desert sun. When he passed, the land was lost to debt, and Clara was left with nothing but her father's cabin and the weight of his name, which no one in town respected. She worked where she could, washing clothes, cleaning floors, serving tables at the saloon, but even honest work wasn't enough to escape the stares and laughter of those who thought themselves better. The saloon was the only place she could earn enough to eat, but it was also the place where her dignity was stripped away piece by piece. Drunken cowhands made jokes when she passed by, and the women who came in with their fancy bonnets sneered as though her presence were an insult. Yet Clara endured. She had learned long ago that in the West, survival wasn't for the proud, it was for the stubborn. One night a fight broke out in the saloon. It started over a card game, like most fights did, but it turned ugly fast. Chairs broke, fists flew, and someone pulled a knife. Clara ducked behind the counter as gunfire cracked through the smoky air. When it ended, a man lay bleeding near the door, and a hush fell over the room. The sheriff arrived a few minutes later, his boots echoing across the wooden floor, but by then the killer was gone. No one saw who it was, or so they claimed. That was when the whispers began. Some said an Apache warrior had been seen near town earlier that day. Others swore they saw him watching from the ridge above the creek, silent, fierce, and proud. The people of Dry Creek had long feared the Apache tales of their raids and vengeance spreading faster than truth. To most settlers, they were ghosts of the desert, unforgiving and wild. But to Clara, the idea stirred something different. She didn't know why, but she didn't feel the same fear. Maybe it was because she already knew what it meant to be hunted by your own kind. The days passed, and the unease grew. Horses went missing, campfires flickered in the hills, and a rancher's son swore he heard voices in the canyon at night. The sheriff doubled his patrols, and the townsmen loaded their rifles. But Clara had other worries. Her landlord wanted the rent she didn't have, and the saloon owner had started making threats. One evening, as she left work, he followed her into the alley, his breath heavy with whiskey. She tried to pull away, but his hand clamped down hard on her wrist. "You owe me," he said. Her heart raced. The street was empty. No one would help her. Then suddenly, there was a sound, a low growl, more animal than human. The saloon owner froze, his grip loosening. From the shadows, a tall figure stepped forward, wrapped in a dark blanket, his face half covered. His eyes glinted like steel beneath the brim of the night. He said nothing, only stood between them. The saloon owner muttered a curse and stumbled back toward the door, too afraid to look twice. Clara stood trembling, unable to speak. When she looked up again, the stranger was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind and the faint scent of smoke. That night she lay awake, replaying what had happened. She'd heard stories of an Apache leader who moved like a ghost, striking fast and vanishing before dawn. Some said he'd lost his family to soldiers and carried vengeance in his heart. Others said he was more than a man, part spirit, part shadow. Clara didn't believe in legends, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whoever that stranger was, he'd saved her life. Over the next few days, she began to notice things. A small bundle of firewood left by her door in the morning, a deer hide stretched neatly across the fence post. The townsfolk whispered that the Apache were near again, but no raids came. Clara kept her silence, unsure if she should be afraid or grateful. For the first time in years, someone had seen her not as a servant, not as a disgrace, but as a person worth protecting. One evening, she walked to the creek outside town, where the red rocks caught the last light of sunset. She thought she was alone until she saw him again standing across the water, still and quiet. He wore no war paint, no weapons visible, only the calm strength of someone who didn't need them. Clara hesitated, her breath caught between fear and wonder. The man looked at her, his gaze steady. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel. "You should not walk here alone," she wanted to answer but found no words. Something about his presence calmed her, even as it unsettled her. He turned to leave, but she called out, her voice trembling. "Why are you helping me?" He paused for a moment. Because they would not. That night Clara couldn't sleep. His words echoed in her mind. There was pain behind them, a truth she felt, but didn't understand. She knew if anyone in town discovered she had spoken to an Apache, they'd turn on her faster than a dust storm. Yet something deep within her stirred a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. Days turned to weeks. Clara began to see him more often. Sometimes from afar, sometimes close enough that she could hear the soft rhythm of his breath. He never asked for anything, never crossed a line, yet his presence became the one steady thing in her life. He showed her where wild herbs grew, taught her how to read the tracks in the sand, how to listen to the desert's silence. She began to laugh again, quietly at first, as if afraid the world might punish her for it. But the town was not blind. Rumors started to spread of the Apache ghost who haunted the edge of Dry Creek and of the woman he protected. Some said she had cursed the town, others that she'd betrayed her own kind. The sheriff warned her to stay away from the hills, but Clara didn't listen. She'd already learned that peace never came from obeying those who despised you. One afternoon, while gathering water at the creek, Clara found a horse's hoofprint beside hers fresh, deep and unfamiliar. Her heart quickened. She looked around but saw no one. Then, across the ridge, a flash of movement, a rider in a blue coat. Soldiers. She dropped the bucket and ran that night. Smoke rose from the valley. The soldiers had come searching for Apache camps, and their path cut straight through the canyon. Clara knew what that meant. If they found him, there would be no mercy. She ran through the dark, the sand cold beneath her bare feet, calling his name into the wind. The only answer was the crack of distant gunfire. When she reached the ridge, she saw the glow of flames and heard the shouts of men below. The Apache camp was under attack. Her breath caught, fear slicing through her chest. She spotted him fighting like a force of nature, outnumbered but unbroken. A soldier raised his rifle behind him. Clara screamed. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Her voice cut through the smoke and chaos, and he turned just in time to see the gun flash. Then everything went silent. The next moment hung heavy and endless. Caught between life and death, between two worlds that had never known peace. And somewhere in that burning canyon, fate was deciding whether pain would endure, just begin. The gunshot echoed through the canyon, sharp and final, and Clara's heart stopped with it. Smoke hung thick in the air, glowing orange under the light of the burning tents. She stumbled forward, choking on ash, her eyes searching through the chaos for any sign of him. Soldiers shouted orders somewhere in the dark, and the ground trembled under the sound of hooves. Every instinct told her to run, but she couldn't. Not when he was still out there. She moved between the rocks, her skirts torn and her hands scraped raw. Flames licked at the dry brush around her, and the heat burned her throat. Then she saw him through the haze on one knee, clutching his shoulder, blood darkening the fabric of his tunic. Relief and fear crashed together in her chest. She started toward him, but a soldier caught sight of her. His voice carried over the roar of the fire. "You there? Stop?" Clara froze. The soldier raised his rifle, but before he could aim, the Apache turned sharply and threw his knife. The weapon struck the man's hand, sending the gun spinning into the dirt. The soldier cried out and fell back, and the warrior staggered to his feet, his eyes finding Clara through the smoke. "Go!" he shouted, his voice rough with pain. She hesitated only for a second before running toward. The dark hills, the two of them climbed the rocky slope as gunfire cracked behind them. Clara could hear the soldiers shouting, their boots pounding closer. The Apache moved fast, despite his wound, his strength steady and quiet. When they finally reached the ridge, he turned and fired an arrow into the ground, its flaming tip bursting in sparks that distracted the pursuers long enough for them to disappear into the desert shadows. They didn't stop until the canyon was just a faint glow behind them. The desert stretched out before them, wide and silent, the stars bright above. Clara dropped to her knees, gasping for breath. He stood a few feet away, pressing a hand to his shoulder. Blood stained his fingers, but his face showed no sign of fear. She reached into her shawl and tore a strip from it, stepping forward. "Let me help," she whispered. He didn't move at first, only studied her face as if unsure whether to trust her. Then, slowly, he nodded. She wrapped the cloth tightly around the wound, her hands trembling. The smell of smoke still clung to his skin, mixed with the faint scent of earth and sage. When she finished, he looked at her and said quietly, "You should not have come." "I couldn't stay," she replied. "They would have killed you." He was silent for a moment, then turned his gaze toward the horizon. "They kill what they do not understand." The night wind was cold, but Clara barely felt it. Her thoughts spun between fear and awe. This man, feared by the settlers and hunted by soldiers, had risked his life for her twice, yet he spoke with calm strength, not anger. She wanted to ask his name, but something in his expression told her that names carried weight among his people. So she said only, "Will you be all right?" He looked down at his wound and then back at her. "I have known worse." They found shelter in a shallow cave beneath the rocks. The fire they built was small, just enough to keep warm. Clara sat across from him, her knees drawn close, watching as he sharpened a stone-tipped arrow. In the flickering light, his face seemed both fierce and kind, marked by lines of hardship and memory. She wondered what stories lay behind those eyes. When the silence stretched too long, she spoke softly. "The people in town. They say terrible things about your kind." He didn't look up. "And what do you believe?" She thought about it. "I used to be afraid," she admitted. "But I think fear comes easy when you don't know someone. They've never seen what I've seen." He glanced at her then, his eyes catching the firelight. "And what have you seen?" "Cruelty," she said. "From those who call themselves good?" He nodded, as if her words were something he already understood. Then he leaned back against the rock and said quietly, "I was a child when soldiers came to our valley. They burned our homes, took our horses, and left our dead in the river. Since that day, I fight so no one can do the same again." His voice carried no hatred, only the calm weight of truth. Clara felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Do not be sorry. Just remember." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind. Clara thought of Dry Creek, of the people who would call her a traitor if they knew she was here. Yet, for the first time in years, she didn't feel ashamed. In that quiet desert cave, she felt more seen than she ever had among her own. When morning came, the light painted the rocks in gold and rose. The Apache stirred first, testing the strength of his arm. He winced, but stood tall. "We must move before the soldiers return," he said. "Where will we go?" she asked. "To the mountains," he replied. "There are places where their horses cannot follow." Clara hesitated. "And what about me?" "If they find out I helped you, they already have," he said simply. "You cannot go back." The words hit her like a stone. She turned away, her eyes stinging. Everything she had left, as little as it was, now belonged to another life she could never return to. The small cabin, her father's grave. The narrow streets of Dry Creek, it was all gone. He noticed her silence and added gently, "You will be safer with me." She met his gaze, searching for any sign of deceit, but found none. There was only quiet certainty. She nodded slowly. "Then I'll go." The days that followed were long and harsh. They traveled by night to avoid the soldiers, resting during the day in hidden ravines and dry washes. Clara learned quickly how to find water in the cactus roots, how to walk without leaving tracks, how to listen for the smallest sound. The Apache spoke little, but his presence was steady, his movements graceful and precise. She began to sense the rhythm of his world, the silence between each breath. the way he seemed to belong to the land itself sometimes. When the desert was still and the stars blazed overhead, he would tell her small pieces of his life. His tribe once lived near the White Mountains, free and proud. He spoke of his mother's songs, of the laughter of children before war came, of the spirit of the land that had watched over them long before the settlers arrived. Clara listened, feeling both sorrow and wonder. The West, she knew, had always been cruel, but through his stories, she saw another side, a world of honor, family, and belonging. One evening, as they camped near an old, dry riverbed, Clara asked quietly, "Do you hate them?" "The settlers." He looked into the fire. "Hate is a heavy thing," he said. "It kills the one who carries it first." She studied his face, realizing how deeply his words carried truth. "And yet you still fight," she said. He nodded. "To protect what is left, not to destroy." Clara fell silent. She understood something then, that strength was not just in battle or vengeance, but in the will to keep one's heart from hardening. But peace was never meant to last long in the frontier. One afternoon, as they climbed the rocky path toward the mountain pass, a column of smoke rose in the distance. The Apache stopped, his expression darkening. "Soldiers," he said quietly. "They are burning another camp." Clara's stomach twisted. "What will you do?" He didn't answer. He only stared at the smoke for a long time, his jaw tight, then turned away. "We keep moving." They walked in silence, but Clara could feel the weight pressing on him. That night, as they rested beneath the stars, he sat apart from the fire, staring into the dark hills. She wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but something in his stillness held her back. There was a storm brewing not just in the sky, but in the hearts of men. When dawn came, the air was tense and heavy. The Apache woke her early. "We are close to the sacred valley," he said. "My people may still be there." A spark of hope flickered in his voice, and Clara felt it too. But deep down, a part of her feared what waited ahead. The soldiers would not stop until they had hunted every trace of his tribe, and if they found her with him, there would be no mercy. Still, she followed without hesitation. She didn't know what lay ahead and laid, that her life now belonged to this uncertain path. The road behind her was gone, and before her stretched a land wild and unforgiving, yet somehow more alive than it had ever been, as the sun climbed over the mountains. Painting the desert in firelight, the Apache paused on the ridge and looked back. "Once we cross this," he said softly, "there is no return." Clara met his gaze, her heart steady. "Then let's keep walking." Below them the valley waited, silent, beautiful, and full of danger. And somewhere beyond that horizon, fate was still writing their story. The trail through the mountains was narrow and steep, lined with loose stones that clattered down into the canyons below. The wind carried a chill sharper than any knife, and the sky above was heavy with dark clouds that threatened rain. Clara followed close behind the Apache, her steps careful but sure. They had been traveling for days without rest, guided only by his quiet instincts and the faint trails left behind by those who once lived free in these lands. Each mile deeper into the wilderness pulled her further from the world she had known. Yet, with every step, she felt herself changing too. The fear that had once clung to her heart was fading, replaced by something stronger, something she couldn't yet name. Still, she knew danger was never far. Soldiers had been seen patrolling the plains below, and rumors spread faster than wind in the west. Clara understood now that their journey was not just about survival. It was about something larger, a fight for dignity, for truth, for the right to exist. That night, they made camp in a small hollow, sheltered by cedar trees. The Apache gathered branches for a small fire, his movements silent and deliberate. Clara watched him from across the flames, noticing the faint tremor in his arm, where the wound still hadn't fully healed. She wanted to speak, to ask how much farther they had to go, but his expression told her his thoughts were elsewhere. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you think your people are still in the valley?" He looked into the fire, the light reflecting in his dark eyes. "I hope so," he said. "But hope can be dangerous." Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. You've carried worse dangers. He gave a faint smile at that, just a flicker, gone as soon as it appeared. You are not like them, he said quietly. Like who? She asked. The settlers, he replied. You see before you judge. You listen before you speak. Few have that strength. His words made her chest tighten. For years she had been judged, ridiculed, treated like dirt beneath people's boots. And yet here, in the middle of nowhere, a man the world called savage saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. But before she could respond, he turned sharply toward the trees, his hand on the handle of his knife. Clara froze. The fire crackled softly, and then she heard it faint rustling. A whisper of movement beyond the shadows. He motioned for her to stay still. A moment later, a small group of figures emerged from the darkness, men and women dressed in worn hides, their faces painted with ash. The Apache's hand lowered, his shoulders easing. My people, he murmured. Relief washed over Clara as the group stepped closer. An older man at the front carried a spear, his eyes sharp but tired. He and the Apache exchanged quiet words in their own tongue, the kind that carried more meaning than she could grasp. After a moment, the older man's gaze turned to Clara. His expression hardened, his voice low and distrustful. She is with me, the Apache said, his tone firm. She is under my protection. The old man studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly, though the suspicion didn't leave his face. The others followed suit, setting down their packs and weapons. Clara noticed a few children among them, thin, barefoot, eyes wide with exhaustion. It hit her then how much they had lost. These were not warriors out for blood. They were families tired, hunted, clinging to whatever hope remained. As the night deepened, small camp filled with murmurs and the faint crackle of the fire. The Apache spoke with the elders in low voices while Clara sat nearby, trying to make sense of the fragments she could understand. They spoke of soldiers raiding their camps, of sickness spreading, of dwindling food. Every word carried the weight of survival. Later, one of the younger women brought Clara a bowl of stew and smiled faintly before walking away. It was the first gesture of kindness she had felt from anyone besides him since leaving Dry Creek. She ate slowly, watching the flames dance against the rocks, wondering how long this fragile peace could last. When the camp finally fell quiet, the Apache sat beside her. They will move again by dawn, he said. The soldiers are close, and we'll go with them, she said. He shook his head. You should not stay with us. The farther you go, the greater the danger. Clara frowned. You think I care about danger now? He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. You owe me nothing. I know, she said softly. But I owe myself more than running away again. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once, a silent agreement that said more than words ever could. At dawn, the group began their climb toward the valley. The sun rose behind them, streaking the sky with red. The land ahead was rough and dry, but the Apache walked as if guided by memory. Clara followed closely, her heart pounding with the weight of what lay ahead. By midday, the valley opened before them, a vast stretch of green hidden between high cliffs. Streams shimmered in the distance, and the remains of old lodges stood near the riverbank. It was beautiful, untouched, yet there was an eerie stillness in the air. The Apache slowed, his eyes scanning the ground. Something was wrong. He knelt beside a patch of earth, brushing aside a thin layer of dust to reveal boot prints, fresh ones. Soldiers, he said quietly. They were here. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The others began whispering among themselves, fear spreading like wildfire. The Apache stood, his jaw tight. They know about this place. We cannot stay, an elder spoke up, his voice trembling with anger. We have nowhere else to go. Our people are dying. Clara watched as the argument grew heated. The Apache tried to reason with them, but grief and desperation spoke louder than logic. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to flee deeper into the mountains. Clara could see the pain in his eyes as he tried to hold his people together, torn between protecting them and facing an enemy that wouldn't stop. That night, tension hung heavy over the camp. The fire burned low, and the air was thick with worry. Clara sat beside the river, staring at her reflection in the dark water. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what they were fighting for, not just survival, but the right to live without being hunted. Without being broken by fear, the Apache joined her. Sitting in silence for a while before speaking, "They will not rest until we are gone," he said. "Then we won't let them win," she answered. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You speak as if you are one of us." "Maybe I am," she said quietly. "The world I came from doesn't want me either." Studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Then you stay with me." Before she could reply, a faint sound broke through the night, the distant crack of a rifle. The camp went still. Then another shot echoed, closer this time. The Apache jumped to his feet, his knife drawn. "They've found us," he said. Panic spread through the camp as people scrambled to gather what they could. Mothers clutched their children, men grabbed their bows, and the elders urged everyone toward the narrow path leading deeper into the mountains. The Apache barked orders, his voice calm amid the chaos. Clara followed him, her heart hammering. The soldiers' torches glowed in the distance, moving steadily closer. Bullets hissed through the dark, striking rocks and sending sparks flying. Clara ducked behind a boulder, clutching the Apache's arm. "There's too many," she said breathlessly. He looked at her, his eyes fierce and unyielding. "Then we make them believe there are more of us." He took a torch and ran toward the far side of the valley, setting brush fires in their path. Flames spread quickly, lighting the night in wild orange. The soldiers shouted, confused as smoke began to fill the air. Clara could barely see him through the haze, but his voice cut through the noise. "Go with them." "I'm not leaving you," she shouted back. But before she could move, the ground shook with the thunder of hooves. Soldiers burst through the smoke, their guns raised, their faces grim. Clara turned to run but tripped on a fallen branch. She hit the ground hard, the world spinning. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw the Apache fighting one man against many, his movements swift and fierce, but there were too many of them. She cried out his name, her voice breaking, and for a brief moment he turned toward her. That moment was all it took. A rifle cracked and the sound ripped through the night. Clara's scream vanished into the wind as the valley burned. The fate of everything she had come to believe in hanging in the balance. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, as the valley burned around them. The fire lit up the night in shades of red and gold, casting long shadows over the rocks. Clara's lungs ached as she tried to crawl through the haze, the smell of gunpowder stinging her throat. Somewhere ahead, she could still hear the Apache's voice shouting orders, though the gunfire drowned out most of the words. The sound of bullets slicing through the air made her flinch with every step. She pressed herself against the earth. Trembling but determined not to stop, the flames roared higher, crackling through the brush, and the ground beneath her glowed faintly with heat. She saw soldiers moving through the smoke, shouting to each other, their rifles gleaming under the orange light. They were sweeping through the camp, searching for survivors. Clara knew that if they found her, there would be no mercy. She could hear the cries of women and children farther up the slope, the sound breaking her heart. Every part of her wanted to run toward them to help. But she knew she had to find him first. She moved between the boulders, crouching low, and spotted a shadow moving just ahead. For a moment, she thought it was one of the soldiers, but when the figure turned, she saw the familiar dark eyes. He was alive, hurt, but still standing. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Behind him, more soldiers were closing in, their torches flickering through the smoke. The Apache motioned for her to stay down, his movements sharp and controlled. Then he reached for his bow, notching an arrow with his good arm. His face was streaked with soot and blood, but his eyes were calm, almost too calm. He loosed the arrow, and it struck true, dropping a soldier before he could fire. The others scattered for cover, shouting. He turned to Clara, his voice hoarse. "Go to the rocks. Stay there." Clara shook her head. "I won't leave you." He didn't answer, only gave her a look that cut straight through her. Then he turned and moved toward the enemy lines, silent as a ghost. She wanted to follow, but something in his stare had frozen her in place. So she crawled toward the rocks like he told her, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the world around her. from behind the ridge. She could see flashes of gunfire and hear the sharp ring of metal against metal. The Apache fought like a man possessed, his movements swift and precise. Every time she thought he would fall, he rose again, driven by something fierce inside him. But she could also see the soldiers regrouping, forming a wide circle to trap him. Clara's hands clenched into fists. She couldn't just watch him die. A small group of the Apache's people were hiding nearby, women, children, and 2 young warriors. Clara crawled to them, her voice trembling. "He needs help," she said. "They'll kill him if we don't do something." One of the young men looked toward the smoke and shook his head. "If we go back, we all die." Clara's frustration boiled over. "It's buying you time. The least you can do is fight for it." The old woman beside them, her face lined with sorrow, placed a hand on Clara's arm. "He is our leader," she said softly. "He fights for us all. You must not waste his sacrifice." Clara felt the tears burn in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay quiet. The fire was spreading fast, devouring what little shelter the valley offered. If they didn't move soon, the smoke alone would finish what the soldiers had started. She looked one last time toward the battlefield, praying he would somehow survive. Then, through the smoke, she saw him fall. Her breath caught in her chest, and the world seemed to tilt. For a moment, she couldn't move. The soldiers advanced. Cautiously, their rifles raised, and the sight of them filled her with a kind of fury she had never known before. She grabbed a fallen rifle from the ground and ran toward him before anyone could stop her. The gun felt heavy in her hands. But her fear had turned into something else, pure instinct. She fired once, then twice, forcing the soldiers to scatter. The sound echoed through the canyon, each shot cutting through the roar of fire. One of the soldiers fell, clutching his arm. Another ducked behind a wagon. Clara dropped behind a rock, reloading clumsily, her fingers shaking. She could hear shouts now, angry and panicked. When she reached the Apache's side, he was still breathing, but barely. His shoulder was bleeding again, and a deep gash ran down his side. She knelt beside him, her voice breaking. "You're not dying here," she whispered. He opened his eyes slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. "You never listen." "Then don't expect me to start now," she said, pressing her hand over the wound. "We have to move." The soldiers were closing in again, their boots crunching against the gravel. Clara pulled his arm over her shoulder and tried to lift him, but he was too heavy. He struggled to stand, his jaw tightening with pain. "Leave me," he said through gritted teeth. "Go," she shook her head. "I won't." He stared at her for a long moment, then finally gave in. Together they stumbled toward the narrow path that led up the canyon. The smoke stung their eyes and the heat seared their skin, but they kept moving. Behind them, the soldiers shouted, firing blindly into the haze. Bullets struck the rocks around them, sending shards of stone flying. Clara's legs screamed with pain, but she didn't stop. When they reached the top of the ridge, they collapsed behind a cluster of boulders. From there, they could see the valley below, a sea of flame and chaos. The Apache people were scattering into the hills, chased by soldiers. The camp, the lodges, the river, everything was burning. Clara felt sick. All that beauty, all that hope, turning to ash, the Apache sat beside her, his breathing shallow. His gaze was fixed on the destruction below, his eyes dark and unreadable. "They will not stop," he said softly. "It's not until everything's gone." Clara looked at him, her voice shaking. "Then we stop them." He turned to her, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. "You would fight a war that is not yours?" "It became mine the moment they made me less than human," she said. "And the moment you saved me?" He said nothing for a long time, then reached for her hand. "If we do this, there is no turning back." "I already turned back once in my life," she said. "I won't do it again." Rested only long enough to catch their breath before moving again. The soldiers had split into groups, hunting through the rocks. Every few minutes, a gunshot rang out in the distance. The night was full of echoing cries and the crackle of burning wood. Clara followed close behind him as they wound their way through a narrow ravine. The path was steep, but it led toward the cliffs overlooking the Valia place where they could see everything. And maybe, just maybe, find a way to strike back. By the time they reached the top, the moon had vanished behind thick clouds. Below them, The valley glowed faintly with dying fire. The soldiers had set up camp near the river, their tents casting shadows that rippled across the ground. Clara counted at least 20 men, maybe more. The Apache studied the layout carefully, his eyes scanning every movement. "If we can lead them toward the pass," he said, "the rocks will do the rest." "You mean trap them?" He nodded. "It is the only way." Clara hesitated. "And what about your people?" "We'll go east before dawn," he said. "If we do this right, the soldiers will follow us instead." She realized then what he meant. "You're planning to draw them away," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Clara felt her chest tighten. "You'll die if you stay here." "Maybe," he said, "but they will live." She looked out over the valley at the faint glow of campfires, and at the man beside her who had risked everything for people who had lost nearly all. The thought of losing him made her heart ache in a way she couldn't explain. Before she could speak again, a faint sound came from below, the soft crunch of footsteps. She peered over the edge and saw soldiers climbing up the trail toward them. Her breath caught. "They're coming!" she whispered. The Apache's eyes hardened. "Then we make our stand here." The next moments unfolded like thunder. He strung his bow and fired the first arrow, striking the lead soldier before the rest could react. Clara grabbed the rifle she'd taken earlier and aimed low, her hands steady despite her fear. The air filled with the sound of battle again, gunfire, shouting, the hiss of arrows cutting through the dark. The soldiers advanced, but the narrow path worked against them. Rocks tumbled down with every shot, and the Apache used the terrain to his advantage, forcing them into confusion. Clara fired again and again, her ears ringing, her heart pounding. Each time she reloaded, she thought of the people hiding in the hills, of everything they had lost, and she refused to stop. When the smoke cleared for a brief moment, she saw that more soldiers were climbing from the other side. They were surrounded. The Apache turned toward her, blood streaking down his arm, his face pale but fierce. "Go," he said again, his voice breaking through the chaos. "I'm not leaving you," she cried, her eyes burning with tears. He looked at her with something deep and unspoken, a promise, a farewell, a kind of love that didn't need words. Then he turned back toward the ridge, drawing his last arrow. The soldiers were almost upon them now. The night shook with gunfire, and the sky lit up with fire once more. Clara's heart raced as she clutched the rifle, her breath shallow, knowing the moment that would decide everything was only seconds away. The sound of the final volley echoed through the mountains. A storm of thunder and fire as the world held its breath. The world was still for a moment after the gunfire stopped. The echo of it faded slowly into the mountains, leaving only a low crackle of burning brush and the distant sound of wind moving through the canyon. Clara stayed crouched behind the rocks, her hands trembling as she gripped the rifle. Smoke stung her eyes, and her ears rang with a high, steady hum. When she dared to lift her head, she saw the last of the soldiers retreating down the slope, dragging their wounded with them. The ridge was quiet now, except for the faint sound of breathing beside her. She turned quickly. The Apache lay on the ground, his chest rising and falling shallowly. Blood darkened his shirt, but he was alive. Clara dropped the rifle and rushed to his side, pressing her hands against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered. "It's over. You did it." He opened his eyes slowly, the firelight reflecting in them. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Not yet," Clara shook her head, fighting back tears. "Yes, it is. They're gone. You saved them. You saved all of us." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Then it was worth it." For a long time they stayed there in silence, the night wind cooling the sweat and smoke on their skin. When she finally looked up, she saw the first light of dawn stretching over the horizon. The sky turned soft shades of pink and gold, and for the first time since the fire started, the air felt calm again. Clara helped him sit up slowly, supporting his weight against her shoulder. "We have to get you to the others," she said. "They'll know how to help." The path down the ridge was steep, but the light helped her see where to step. She half-carried, half-guided him through the rocks, stopping often to let him breathe. Every sound, the chirp of birds, the whisper of the river Bielefeld, louder in the quiet that followed the battle. When they reached the valley floor, the sight before them made Clara's heart ache. The camp was nearly gone. Smoke rose from the burned remains of lodges, and the air smelled of ash. But among the wreckage, life still moved. The Apache people were gathering what they could, tending to the wounded, comforting the children. There was loss everywhere, yet there was also strength in the way they stood together. When the old woman saw them approaching, she hurried forward, her eyes filling with tears. "He lives," she murmured, touching his face. The spirits were kind. Clara helped him sit against a fallen log, and the women began to clean his wounds with what herbs and cloth they had left. He winced but said nothing. She stayed beside him, holding his hand while they worked. For the first time since she met him, he seemed at peace. The lines of pain on his face softened as he looked around at his people. "They will rebuild," he said quietly. "They always do." Clara nodded. "And so will you." He looked at her with a faint glimmer of warmth. "You have the heart of one of us," he said. "The fire inside you does not die." She smiled sadly. "I just wanted to survive." "You did more than that," he replied. "You fought for something beyond yourself." As the day went on, the survivors began to move toward the mountains. The soldiers would return eventually, and they knew they couldn't stay in the open. Clara helped gather supplies and water, her clothes still stained with soot. She felt exhausted, but she didn't stop. Each small act, tying a pack, lifting a child, sharing water, felt like a promise to the fallen when they were ready to leave. The Apache leader stood again, leaning heavily on a staff. He refused to be carried. His steps were slow but steady. Clara walked beside him, and together they followed the others into the high pass. The air grew cooler as they climbed, and the wind carried away the last of the smoke. By the time they reached the top, the valley below was just a faint scar on the land. The sun was setting behind the peaks, washing everything in gold. The Apache stopped and looked back one last time. Clara followed his gaze, her throat tightening. "It's hard to leave," she said softly. He nodded. "But sometimes you must let the earth close over what was lost, so new life can begin." They camped in the high meadow that night. The stars came out bright and clear, and the world felt wide and endless again. Clara lay awake, listening to the quiet breathing of the people around her. Every sound of life, the murmur of voices, the soft steps of horses was a reminder of what they had fought for. When she finally drifted to sleep, she dreamed of water running clear through the valley again, of green grass and laughter where ashes once lay. In the morning, she woke to find the Apache sitting near the fire, his wounds bandaged, his face calm. He handed her a piece of bread and motioned for her to eat. "You will need strength," he said. She smiled faintly. "Where will you go now?" He looked toward the mountains, farther east. "There are still places where we can live free, but the world changes. It will not be easy." Clara hesitated. "Then let me come with you," shook his head slowly. "Your path is not with us. The world you came from still calls you back. There are things only you can tell them." She frowned, not understanding. "Tell them what?" He met her eyes. "That we are not beasts. That the land remembers kindness and cruelty alike. That freedom cannot live under a flag alone." His words stayed with her long after the camp began to move again. She knew he was right. Her life before all this, the town, the people, the fear felt far away now, but she couldn't forget it. She had seen too much to go back unchanged. When they reached the next valley, where the mountains met the plains, the Apache stopped. He turned to her and handed her a small, tokena beaded string from his wrist, marked with red and white stones. "For remembrance," he said. "When you doubt yourself, hold this and listen to the wind." Clara took it carefully, her voice soft. "Thank you." "For everything," he nodded once, his expression unreadable. Then he mounted his horse, his people following behind him. She watched as they rode toward the horizon, their figures growing smaller against the light. When the last of them disappeared over the ridge, she stood there for a long time, a token clutched in her hand. Days later, Clara found her way to a small town near the river. The people there looked at her with curiosity and caution. Her clothes were torn, her skin darkened by sun and smoke. Some whispered that she'd gone mad wandering through Apache land, but she didn't care. She went to the sheriff's office, where a map of the frontier hung on the wall. The valley wasn't marked on it, as if it had never existed. When he asked what had happened out there, she only said, "I found people who still remember what it means to live free." After that, she worked quietly in the town, helping in the small school and tending to those who had little. But every time the wind blew from the west, she could almost hear the faint sound of drums, the cry of an eagle high above. She would close her eyes and see the Apache's face in the glow of firelight, his words echoing in her heart. Years passed, but the memory of that valley never left her. She often walked to the river's edge at sunset, the same time the fire had once burned through the canyon. There she would hold the beaded string in her palm and whisper a silent prayer for him, for the people who fought beside him, for the land that bore witness to their struggle. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned gold, she saw something shining on the water. A feather, carried by the wind, landed at her feet. She picked it up, feeling a strange peace wash over her. Maybe the land did remember, just as he said. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes on the horizon. The world had taken so much, yet somehow it had given her back something greater, a truth she could never unlearn. That courage, kindness, and freedom were not given by anyone. They were chosen again and again, even when the world tried to take them away. And as the last light faded, she whispered his name into the wind, knowing it would find its way back to the mountains where it belonged.